Now on to our patient speaker for the evening. It's a great personal and a professional pleasure to introduce Khatchig Mouradian for the first time as a speaker here at NAASR. Hardly his first time speaking. If you follow the news, Khatchig is giving a lecture somewhere approximately every 45 minutes, I think. So we are really happy to have him here. It's a personal pleasure because I've known Khatchig for 5 or 6 years now, since even before he moved to Watertown from Beirut, where he grew up and where he was working as an editor at Asdag magazine, a newspaper, and he was doing a master's at Haigazian University. Today he is a PhD student at the Strasser Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark. He is the first PhD student to be prepared by the Kalustian Mugar Chair at Clark, which is a distinction in its own right. And he's also, of course, the very skillful editor of the Armenian Weekly newspaper. And I wanted to convey, because he's not here, what Taner Akjam wrote to me this afternoon, because he's out of town. He wrote to say that his apologies to everyone here for not being here, and he said, "Don't forget to tell them how proud I am of Khatchig." I think that means he's proud of you, Khatchig. Khatchig's doctoral dissertation focuses on the destruction of the Armenians in the Syrian desert during the genocide. It's going to be an important piece of work, and many of us are looking forward to it. He has lectured extensively, underlined, extensively, and participated in academic conferences in the US, overseas, presenting papers on Raphael Lemkin, media, human rights, the Armenian Genocide, and other topics, and he writes for a number of national and international publications. Tonight, we're going to hear about Raphael Lemkin and the Armenian Genocide in light of new research. So please welcome Khatchig Mouradian.
So am I supposed to speak both of these?
You can sort of just one in the middle, or
okay. So, thank you, Mark, for that introduction. It is a pleasure for me to be here. It is a pleasure for me to talk about this particular topic. This is a topic that really got me into academia. This is a topic that really generated an interest in me to move from journalism to scholarly work. And it's a topic that has very much, in many ways, defined my journey, both in journalism and, as I said, as someone venturing into academia in the scholarly realm as well. I have presented on different versions of this particular paper in several universities, in several venues, at several conferences, and it is sort of a topic that I'm very passionate about. And one day, I'm hopeful that something can be, more tangible, can be published on it. I've published one paper on this particular topic, which really looks at not specifically the case of Raphael Lemkin, but the evolution of the discourse on the Armenian genocide in Armenian newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic, in the Middle East, in Europe, and the United States, over a 60-year period, from 1915, of course, all the way to the 50th anniversary, and then later on of the Armenian Genocide. Now, what I want to do here is try to move the discourse, the discussion around Raphael Lemkin's association with the Armenian Genocide into a level of beyond talking about the fact that Raphael Lemkin knew about the Armenian Genocide. Raphael Lemkin was inspired, was influenced by the Armenian Genocide when he was thinking of, when he coined the term genocide, and then really dedicated his life to making genocide a crime punishable by law, and try to see, examine the dynamics behind the relationship between Armenians and Raphael Lemkin. These are, it's always a challenge to decide where to start this narrative. I generally start with with the moment in 1921 in Berlin where Solomon Tehlirian assassinates Talat Pasha. This is the same starting point for Samantha Power in her book A Problem from Hell, and I do believe that really it is in many ways a significant point to begin with. But I will today start from this. On top you will see the memorial and the grave of Solomon Tehlirian in Fresno, California. This particular sculpture shows obviously a eagle and a snake, and the eagle signifies Tehlirian and snake signifies Talat Pasha. At the bottom we have Raphael Lemkin's grave. This is in Queens, New York. Raphael Lemkin died penniless. Raphael Lemkin died and only very few people were there for his funeral. A person who had dedicated his entire life, his entire earnings, whatever they were, because he was constantly on the move and doing things, engaged in activism, to make genocide a crime punishable by law. However, he was, for a long period of time, he was forgotten, sometimes conveniently because of political considerations. The Cold War had a significant role in that. And there is, in recent years, however, an increasingly greater interest in Lemkin's life, both biography, his scholarly contribution. And I would argue that it has also spurred a renewed interest in issues like cultural genocide, colonial cases of genocide, etc. And then coming back to the starting point, sometime in 1921, the paths of these three individuals here, Raphael Lemkin, Solomon Tehlirian, and Talat Pasha cross. In March 1921, Solomon Tehlirian assassinates Talat Pasha in Berlin. Lemkin is a student, is studying linguistics at the University of Lvov when he hears about the assassination. It was covered by the newspapers in Europe. It did receive a good amount of coverage, and this was specifically in the case of Lemkin. This really triggered one of the interests he it seems always had in issues of mass violence. And scholars, do not really agree specifically when and where this interest started. But Lemkin was born in Raphael Lemkin was born in 1900, and he in Poland, in eastern areas of Poland. The particular area where he lived was under, depending on at what point you're looking at the map, was under a different, it was one of those borderlands that came under different controls, under the control of different powers at different times. Now, he experienced during his childhood, early teenage years, attacks. He learned about pogroms against Jews. He was of Polish Jewish descent. His family, he came from a Jewish background, and it's very difficult to really pinpoint a period or a time where his interest in mass violence developed. But it's probably, there is no such point. It's probably more of an evolution in this particular interest. So when Solomon Tehlirian assassinates Talat Pasha, this is one of the moments, one of the significant turning points in Raphael Lemkin's career. Because first it moves him in the direction, from the direction of linguistic to the direction of law. So he is really challenged by this question of why should an individual take revenge for the murder of his family, of his people, and there is no such international law that really punishes these criminals. In this sense, the assassination of Talat Pasha was considered a trigger. And he constantly talks about this. I know there are out there a couple of examples of, Raphael Lemkin, dealing with this issue. The most famous one probably is the CBS interview he gave in 1949, where he says, "I became interested in genocide because it happened to the Armenians, and afterwards the Armenians got a very rough deal at the Versailles Conference, because their criminals were guilty of genocide and were not punished. A man, so Montelivia, whose mother was killed in the genocide, killed Talat Pasha, and he told the court that he did it because his mother came in his sleep many times. Here, the murder of your mother, you would do something about it, so he committed a crime. So you see, as a lawyer, I thought that a crime should not be punished by the victims, but should be punished by a court, by national law." In this lecture, I will ask three questions that are essentially interconnected. The first is, what was the influence of Lemkin on the Armenian discourse on genocide? And then, what was the influence of Armenian genocide on Lemkin? And finally, what was the extent and significance of the collaboration between Lemkin and the Armenians? This third question has received very little attention, and I will try to explore this based on a number of sources, including Lemkin's archives, Armenian newspapers, and other sources. How did the Armenians refer to the Armenian genocide before the term was coined? I've actually looked at newspapers on 3 continents, some of the most vibrant communities: Lebanon, France, the United States. The newspapers published by independent newspapers published by political parties, the Ramgavas, the Hanchaka, and the ARF. And one of the most common terms, and this comes as no surprise to you, of course, is Medz Yerer, or variants of it. Yerer sometimes appears alone. It's almost always capitalized. Depending on what period we're talking about, Yerer could mean anything from catastrophe to crime. And I'll talk about this a little later. Aret is another term that comes up, not as often as Yerer. Other terms are Medz Vochberkuchun, great tragedy, Medz Vochchagez, great Holocaust, Medz Nahadaguchun, great martyrdom, Medz Nachjir, Spont, Chart, Ayaspamuchun. Of course, this is in publications, right? These are the terms mostly used by intellectuals, by scholars, by journalists. In popular discourse, probably chart is more common, and of course, again, as I said, different variations of it. I want to dwell a little on the term Yerer because it has received such significance recently by President Obama and before him, President Bush and the Pope. It has become sort of a 4-letter word because of the way it is used. Because it is used not to acknowledge the Armenian word for this great crime, but to avoid using the proper description of it. So in that sense, the term Yerer, which, as I said, it was widely used by Armenians before the term genocide was coined, and even after the term genocide was coined, all the way into the 80s, it was the more common word used by Armenians, at least in Armenian-speaking communities. So has come to receive this kind of, now is really approached, when somebody hears it, the immediate association comes with President Obama's statements, and also statements by some Turkish intellectuals. The Apology campaign, launched by Turkish intellectuals, also used a Turkish translation of Yerer, or one of these terms. The Yerer term is mentioned in the oldest Armenian writings. It is mentioned several times in the Armenian translation of the Bible. I've actually I have a whole list of the number of times it's mentioned in the Bible. And as you know, the Bible was the first translation into Armenian after the discovery of the Armenian alphabet, the creation of the Armenian alphabet. The term was also used in the 19th century and the early 20th century to refer to the massacres of the Armenians 1894-96 and to the Ottoman massacres. So before even the Armenian Genocide of 1915, the term was used in the context of the Ottoman Empire. And as I said later, it was used in capitalized form to describe the destruction of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. If you look at the newspapers around this time, around the time when Raphael Lemkin is struggling for the ratification of the Genocide Convention by the UN, there is this increased interest by Armenians towards this particular word. Turkish revisionist, denialist historiography and the Turkish official historians, the state who defended Turkey's official state position, often say that the Armenians adopted the term genocide in order to compare themselves to the Jews and to compare their own experience to the experience of the Jewish people during the Holocaust. What I have found, and I will share with you here, is examples of how the process is actually the reverse. It was non-Armenians who first talked about 1915 as being a genocide. Chief among them, clearly Raphael Lemkin, and the Armenians noticed this connection, and then this gradually became part of the discourse of Armenian newspapers and publications. But before that, let me start with a quote. This is the very first instance I have found of the term genocide in Armenian, tseraspanutun, being used in an Armenian language publication anywhere in the world. That's a huge statement, of course. I haven't looked at every single newspaper and document anywhere. But the areas I've looked are crucial, both in terms of the discussion around the word genocide internationally, and also as far as the activism and the involvement of the communities of that area are concerned. The first mention is in December 9, 1945. Raphael Lemkin coined the term genocide sometime in 1943. That's when he wrote the introduction for his book Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. And 1944, the book was published. The word genocide was in the book. 1945, October, the third count of the Nuremberg indictment stated that the defendants had conducted deliberate and systematic genocide. This was the first time when Lemkin was really trying to. This was his first attempt to get the term genocide into the legal discourse. He eventually fails in this because the final Nuremberg statement does not include the term genocide, but this, as I said, the third count of the indictment includes the term genocide. And a few months later, we read an editorial published in Harac, the French Armenian newspaper, December 9, 1945, that says, "We read these lines after introducing the term genocide. We follow the Nuremberg trials, and our mind instinctively wanders to a faraway world where war crimes took place 30 years ago. Where were the jurists and judges back then? Had they not discovered the word, or was the bloodthirsty monster so powerful or unreachable that they could not punish them?" The person who wrote this editorial is Shavash Misakian, who himself was on the list of the intellectuals to be arrested in Istanbul on April 24 and later, 1915. He eventually was one of the very few who escaped and ended up in France, starting the newspaper Harac. So you can imagine the symbolism of the individual who escaped April 24 to be the first, at least among the intellectuals that I've looked at. The first intellectual to really closely follow the developments on the Armenian genocide, on the term genocide. This frustration of where was the world when we were being massacred is really repeated over and over again in Armenian newspapers of this period. And again, on both sides of the Atlantic. This is from Astak Daily, Beirut, December 11, 1946. Editorial. Was another earth-shaking storm necessary so that men would learn the word tseghaspanochun, genocide? The attempt to exterminate the Armenians en masse, genocide, only served the purpose of filling the pages of books and giving brilliant speeches, while the other attempt of extermination immediately resulted in a logical ending, trials and hanging. December 11, 1946, after months of lobbying by Lemkin, the United Nations General Assembly unanimously passes a resolution condemning genocide. This is not the Genocide Convention, by the way. Again, January 30, a few weeks later, the Hellenic Weekly in Boston reprints on its front page an article from January 5, 1947. I want you to notice how initially the Armenian newspapers are picking up these terms from the international press. It's not like the Armenians are saying, hey guys, we figured out this word, come on, let's use it. It's the international press that is using it when referring to the Armenians. So they reprint this article from the New York Times, titled United Nations Outlaws Murder of Entire Groups as International Crime. And the Hellenic Weekly highlights the following sentence. It says, if the members of the United Nations pass appropriate legislation, such incidents as the pogroms of Tsarist Russia and the massacres of Armenians and Greeks by Turkey would be punishable as genocide. And of course, in the same issue of the newspaper where this New York Times article is reprinted, there's an editorial. It says, again, the same frustration appears here. Outlawing wholesale slaughter of peoples is welcome news to the Armenians, the Greeks, the Syrians, the Arabs, and the Balkan peoples, who used to be systematically decimated under the rule of the barbarous Turk, but ironically enough, it comes after the mischief has been done. It is small comfort to tell already exterminated peoples that they shall no longer be subject to the horrors of wanton destruction. To those peoples who have been fortunate enough to be immune from such mass tragedies, and this is the naivete, right? The security for the future is a precious and reassuring comfort. Of course, as the people of Rwanda, Darfur, and other places will learn, this was not the case. But all this still does not solve the Armenian dilemma. And same editorial concludes by saying, the Armenians were robbed of their historic provinces, they sacrificed a cool 1.5 million human lives, and another 1 million were made expatriates. In compensation for this colossal wrong, the United Nations offers them a genocide. The genocide is hardly the cure for Armenian wounds. The same theme continues now back to the Middle East in editorials in the early 50s. A Second World War was needed so that the West would feel on their own flesh what it means to plot a crime against a nation, and would condemn it by employing the term genocide. Another editorial 2 years later, the condemnation of the crime of genocide in speeches and on paper is not enough. As Raphael Lemkin, around the years when Raphael Lemkin, as I said, was actively involved in the process to get the United Nations ratify the Genocide Convention, the Armenian communities and the Armenian newspapers were actively involved in the discussion. These quotes are from an interview, again in the Hellenic Weekly, 1949, as one who has seen genocide in operation, has lived it and has survived, I find it very difficult to express myself on the subject. How do I feel about this convention and the United Nations on genocide? There is only one feeling that I have, and that everybody should have, and that is to have the treaty ratified by the parliaments of the signatory nations. This is after the Genocide Convention was ratified by the UN. So this is now, the countries have to ratify the convention This is the challenge here. So, essentially, the interviewee is saying that the parliaments of the signatory nations should ratify the convention before it may be too late. Now, I want to zoom in and talk about Raphael Lemkin's interaction, as I said, with the Armenians. There is an interesting, again, he gives several interviews to Armenian newspapers, specifically through a few connections that he had in the Armenian community. I will talk about this later in more detail, but Keshishian, a journalist who was based in the Middle East, and he proved to be crucial in the discussions to really convince some of the Arab countries to ratify the Genocide Convention, and first sign on to it and then ratify it. He conducted an interview with Raphael Lemkin, which was published in Hyrenic, and I believe in other publications as well, in which Lemkin tells Keshishian, "You are an Armenian, you will therefore understand how important this convention is." Now, this is the portion where I talk about the impact Raphael Lemkin, not only the impact Raphael Lemkin had on the discourse on the Armenian genocide among Armenians, but also on the work done together, that he did together with the Armenians, to really have the convention ratified after it was passed by the United Nations. So, just a little bit of a background. Lemkin's initial challenge was to get the United Nations have a genocide convention. This was realized in December 9, 1948, and after that, the Genocide Convention had to be ratified by at least 20 countries, 20 signatory countries, the parliaments of these countries, for it to have for it to have force as international law. So immediately after the Genocide Convention was passed in France, Lemkin started this campaign of convincing different countries to sign on, or different parliaments to ratify the convention. In this process, of course, the United Nations was at the center of his attention, because he lived in the US, and it was important for him, for the US, to ratify the convention. Another country that for him was very important to ratify the convention was Turkey. I'm going to talk about that a little later. But and here we see how Lemkin really uses his connections with different minority groups, how he uses his connections to really push forward his agenda of getting the Genocide Convention ratified by the United States Congress. This is an important juncture, because this really shows how Lemkin he was definitely influenced by the cases of by the Holocaust and the Armenian Genocide when he started this this campain to make genocide punishable by law. But this is the period where you really see Lemkin trying to mobilize all these groups, Jews, Armenians, other minorities from Eastern Europe, to really work with them closely so that there's pressure on the US Congress so that the genocide is ratified, the Genocide Convention is ratified. This is a letter that I found in Lemkin's papers, sent to the editor back then, to James Mandalian, who was back then the editor of the Hyrenic Weekly and the Armenian Review. And in this letter, this is what James Mandalian writes. I mean, imagine, this is a man who is the editor of the two major publications of the ARF back in the day. Also imagine that this is 1950. The Cold War is gradually becoming fiercer as we move forward in this period, and therefore this is a period where the ARF was, as you know, was aligned with the anti-Soviet forces. Now, let's read this letter closely. In compliance with your request, dear Professor Lemkin, in compliance with your request, our Armenian language newspaper, the Hyrenic Daily, published an editorial call inviting our readers to write letters to the members of Senate Foreign Relations Committee Senate Foreign Relations Committee, right? We are still discussing this today. Urging them to do their utmost for the ratification of the Genocide Convention. The enclosed letter which I sent to Senator Lodge was translated and published in our Armenian Daily as a sample to give the readers an idea on how they should write. I'm happy that Senator Lodge was very prompt in his reply to me, the copy of which you will find enclosed. This is just one example. There are several. I'll show you a few. About how essentially Raphael Lemkin was directing, the term he uses here is requesting the Armenian community to be actively involved, and the specific way in which he wants them to be actively involved is for genocide survivors. And remember, this is 1950, we have a lot of them around. Genocide survivors to write letters to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so that US Congress ratifies the Genocide Convention. This is another, in which essentially Lemkin and Turkey tells Lemkin that we have taken steps to fulfill your request by publishing genocide survivors to send letters to foreign relations senators, and will editorialize the issue. Best regards, Lemkin and Turkey. Again, another instance of where you really see Armenian intellectuals getting directly involved to mobilize the Armenian community to press for the ratification of the Genocide Convention. Now, in Lemkin's papers, these are not the only instances where the Armenian issue comes up. You have hundreds, literally hundreds of documents where Lemkin himself discusses the Armenian genocide, gives the Armenian genocide as an example. And you also have many cases in which Lemkin's associates go out, interview genocide survivors, and send him reports, send him letters detailing the content of these interviews. I'm going to share with you one of these letters. It is an interview conducted with a woman in Watertown, an Armenian woman. I have purposely left her name out at this point. Her name and address have been removed. But essentially, let me read a few paragraphs of this just for you to see how Lemkin himself was involved, and he was really getting a lot of activists around him, intellectuals around him, to be passionately involved in pursuit of this cause. Dear Professor, this is addressed to Lemkin. In my interview with Mr. Mandalian, he said he had just received your letter, that he had sent you some material and part of which he had translated, which was no easy task. So the guy is actually working as translator for Lemkin. He said he had another article which he would translate, but due to pressure of work, etc., this would not be ready for about 6 weeks. I suggested he try to have it at the end of that time, before the opening of the assembly, as you might have need of it. Mr. Mandela telephoned me after 2 days and gave me the name of the woman for a first-hand story. At this time, he said he would have some material in English which I could have. So this is the woman's story. This woman lives in Watertown, and she was a survivor of genocide, born in 1904. She talks about how the troubles began in 1915 when she was 11. She remembers all that happened and all the members of her family, and is the only one surviving member. The others were killed or otherwise disposed of by the Turks. She speaks of a journey by caravan, and during the time the grandfather and father were separated from the others. On the same journey, the grandmother and a boy of 6 was hurled over the mountains, while mother arrived in some place she called Dez. Probably Dez is somewhere in Syria, it could even be desert. An aunt who had gotten there before her gave them some assistance. After a stay of 6 months, she was placed in a home with 30 other children. Food was scarce. Let's move on to the rest of the letter. About this time, she's in a desert. Somehow or other, so men and boys shot before the eyes of women and girls, and other men, women, and children were piled into a naturally formed cave, the depth of 1 story, her words. And she too was in the cave. Bushes were piled over the heap of humanity, and it was fired. But she managed to crawl out of the and she displayed her legs and knees, showing the scars she got at that time. She said all around her she saw dead bodies, and she also said that the Turks even ripped open the dead bodies looking for gold in bowls. All this happened from an afternoon into the night. She eventually is sold to an Arab. She lives there in slavery for several years, ends up in Turchnoch-Puin in Lebanon, and eventually comes to the United States, gets married, and has, as we learn, several children who all play the piano. Why did I give this example? As I said, this is another instance where you really see Raphael Lemkin. At this point, he has two passions. One is the ratification of the convention by the countries. The second is preparing a history of genocide. And this is why he is meticulously really collecting material on mass atrocity throughout history from the beginning of time. And these interviews for him were important both as a means to pressure the United States Congress, and also were material for his research. He had files on on all the genocides and mass atrocities throughout history. His files on the Armenian Genocide are in several hundred pages. I'm going to cite from that document on the Armenian Genocide next. This is from page 93 of Turkish Massacre of Armenians by Lemkin. And he says, a strong parallel may be drawn between the extermination of the Armenians by the Turks and the extermination of the Jews by the Germans. The position of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire closely approximated that of the Jews in Germany. The Armenians were the industrious citizens of the empire, with a talent for handicrafts and intellectual pursuits. They had the same gift for commerce as the Jews, and in Asiatic Turkey, it was the Armenian who was the skilled workman and the man of business. Now, this realization that there must be some kind of justice for the victims of the Armenian Genocide haunted Raphael Lemkin. And you see this in several places in his autobiography, and also in his writings, in his other writings, where you really realize he's doing his utmost to get two things done. One is for Turkey to ratify the Genocide Convention, and I'll talk a little bit about this next. And the second is to find some kind of justice, even if it's in a symbolic form, for the victims of the Armenian Genocide. This is from Raphael Lemkin's autobiography, Totally Unofficial Man. He says, a bold plan was formulated in my mind. This consisted of obtaining the ratification by Turkey among the first 20 founding nations. I know, however, that this is in consideration, that in this consideration both sides will have to avoid speaking about one thing, although it would be constantly in their minds, the Armenian. Essentially, it is very ironic that even the person who coined the term genocide and had such a huge impact, as we saw and as we'll see on the discourse on the Armenian Genocide, both among Armenians and beyond, when it came for this political lobbying aspect of it, when it came for him to really push for what he wanted, which was Turkey to ratify the convention, he realized that it was very important for him not to talk about the Armenians. And again, this really brings up a lot of memories from the recent past here in the United States. What does he do? At this point, Lemkin has developed a friendship with a member of the Turkish embassy in the US. He meets with him, and he does not bring up the issue of the Armenian Genocide, of course. He wants to convince Turkey to be one of the first 20 countries, as I said, because he needed 20 countries to ratify the convention, 20 parliaments, for it to have force in international law. He meets with this employee of the Turkish embassy, and he talks with him talks to him about the important developments in Turkey back in the day, and how Turkey has really reformed itself and is moving in a direction that is has made impressive strides towards change and reform. He, apart from his friendship with this one particular Turkish official, he manages, the very next day he has a meeting with this Turkish official, to actually get in touch with the Turkish ambassador to the United Nations. He appeals to him and he says that, you know, if you do not ratify this convention, if the Turkish parliament does not ratify this convention now, and if you're not one of the first 20 countries, after that 20 countries have ratified, the others are just going to be following suit. So you will not be among the leading countries who push this groundbreaking piece of legislation forward. And the Turkish ambassador tells him, you know, he says, I agree with you, and I will convey the message to Ankara. Now, I want to gradually wrap up because and open it up to discussion, because there are different aspects, facets of this whole narrative that could be, you know, we can shed light on based on your interest. Shortly before he died, Raphael Lemkin wrote a book review in the Hellenic Weekly on January 1st, 1959. In it, he really explains talks about some of the role the Armenians played in the process of the ratification of the Genocide Convention. He says, this is the reason why the Armenians of the entire world, the reason being the Armenians themselves being victims of genocide, were specifically interested in the Genocide Convention. They filled the galleries of the drafting committee at the Third General Assembly of the United Nations in Paris, when the Genocide Convention was discussed. An Armenian, Levon Keshishian, the well-known UN correspondent for Arab newspapers, helped considerably through his writings to obtain the ratification of many Near Eastern and North African countries. 1 million Armenians died, but a law against the murder of peoples was written with the ink of their blood and the spirit of their sufferings. And he concludes the book review by saying, the sufferings of the Armenian men, women, and children thrown into the Euphrates River, or massacred on the way to Deir el-Zor, have prepared the way for the adoption for the Genocide Convention by the United Nations and have morally compelled Turkey to ratify it. Thank you very much. Okay, I don't know what I'm reading. It might be something. So this is apparently a letter from Tarpinian to, yes, it says, your previous help on genocide of greatest importance kindly arranged that Armenian survivors of genocide should write letters to senators on Foreign Relations Committee urging immediately ratification Genocide Convention. Personal experiences in massacres described in a simple language should be possibly included in these letters. The senators should be asked to include the letter in congressional record. Kindly reply, cordially, Lemkin, Yale University. This is one of, actually, an original of one of the Western Union. How do we do that?
We say, are there questions?
Are there questions?
And I ask you please to stand up and to speak up.
I've got a question. Could you give sort of a brief timeline of the schedule of when different nations ratified the convention?
Yes.
Yeah, I ask you to more or less recap the question.
Okay, so the question, a brief timeline of, this is a good question, of course, a brief timeline of when different countries ratified the convention. The United States, let's start there. Raphael Lemkin died, as I said, penniless. By the end, by the 50s, his efforts, he was mobilizing Jewish organizations, he was mobilizing Armenian and other minority groups to get the United States to ratify the Genocide Convention. The US did not ratify the convention for a number of reasons. The Soviet Union was one. Slavery was another. There was a group of congressmen who were convinced that slavery would become a serious problem and would be viewed as genocide and used as such by the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc if the United States ratifies the Genocide Convention. This is one major reason, there are others, that the United States does not ratify the convention. Not only that, this is part of the reason that the United States decides to forget Raphael Lemkin. A person who probably would have been up for a Nobel Prize, for a Nobel Peace Prize, and Lemkin was actually thinking about that, but he never got the support because, the United States did not even bother to nominate him for something they had absolutely no interest in ratifying. By the mid-50s, it was over for him. He essentially gave up because first he had some problems with the AJC, some Jewish organizations, so he lost their support, and eventually it just proved impossible to have the convention ratified. The United States would only ratify the convention in 1988, 30 years after the death of Raphael Lemkin.
Did Turkey?
Yes, it did.
It did? How soon?
It was among the first nations who ratified the convention. It is, of course, the story doesn't end here because essentially, for the decades that follow, again, you see how Raphael Lemkin is completely, entirely forgotten. The legacy of a man who, he had nothing. His life was entirely dedicated to this. He lived on, he held university positions as professor, etc., in different universities in New Haven, New Jersey, New York. But essentially, some of the time he was the only work he was doing. And that was his deal with the universities. It took, his campaigning for the Genocide Convention took a lot of his time. Sometimes he received a lot of support. For example, when he was in Paris for the discussions around the Genocide Convention. This was the big thing, right? 1948. He actually managed to stay at the very hotel where many of the delegates were staying. This was expensive. He received financial support from Jewish organizations in the United States. And this was important for him because this was a place, an opportunity for him to rub shoulders with these, these ambassadors. There's one interesting example. This is a good place for me to tell it because I have to, limit myself to 45 minutes. He meets with the United Nations with the Canadian representative to the United Nations, and he starts talking to him. He wants to convince him that the Genocide Convention is important, and Canada should support it. And he starts talking to him. He starts all the way back from the time of the Assyrians, and it seems that it's not really going anywhere. And then, as he comes closer to the modern period, he starts talking about the Armenian Genocide. And the Canadian ambassador says, yes, I know about it. And he talks about how Canada took in Armenian orphans who had survived the Armenian Genocide. So there is this connection that is instantly made. And eventually, this ambassador introduces him to another very powerful figure, the Australian foreign minister, who was going to become, by December 1948, when the discussions were taking place at the UN, the chairperson of the UN General Assembly. And that person himself was a close friend of the Canadian ambassador, and that connection is made that way. So essentially, this is a time when this man is seriously, on a single-handedly almost, really taking on an entire international establishment, and it is an inspiring story of how one person can change that much. But as I said, unfortunately, the United States ratified it too late, and of course, the ratification of the Genocide Convention itself has not guaranteed. The first cases of legal action based on the Genocide Convention happened only in the 90s. Again, so people had to wait half a century for the convention to have some kind of relevance in real life. I hope that partially answers your question. Any other questions? Yes.
Could you tell us more about Senator Lodge? Was he the same Senator Lodge who was instrumental in opposing U.S. and the League of Nations?
Yes.
30 years?
Yes, he was.
The same?
That's my guess, but I'm almost sure he was. Yes. And what I would add here is this issue of so being opposed to the Genocide Convention. This is important. This is probably a place to say this. Had many reasons, and not only senators were very wary of this. There were also people in the Armenian community who were opposed to the Genocide Convention. Even in the United States. I've actually encountered letters to the editor written by Armenians, Armenian Americans, saying that we should not ratify the Genocide Convention because this would be something over the U.S. our Constitution. And this will give the Soviet Union some kind of leverage over the United States. So even Armenian Americans, some of them at least, have really felt that it's not a good idea to ratify the Genocide Convention. So when you see this battle being waged on the level of senators and you know, you have a similar battle. This is just a reflection of the way many Americans thought. Because the main pressing issue of the day was the Cold War. It was not genocide. If anything, people did not want to deal with some of their own past mass atrocities and injustices. So this is the context in which this whole thing plays out. Other questions? Yes?
It was very interesting, the list of expressions you listed at the very beginning in the attempt to come up with a word. I was impressed by the fact that some years ago I came across a writing by Diana Akar in which she used the word Holocaust. And this was at the time when, about the time when she was ambassador to Japan. And I came across a second instance, which was again in that World War I period, where Winston Churchill, in writing about the history of World War I, referred to the Armenian Holocaust. So I've come across two instances where Holocaust was used. There was no, of course, genocide. And it was a search for a word, I would guess, that...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this search is happening on several levels. For example, the term Holocaust is used in the New York Times as well, during the reporting in 1915. For the Armenians, though, and Yedern had this special significance. Because first it had the biblical association. Here it would be great for a scholar to really look into the dynamics of what's in a word, right? The Shoah and the Yedern, and to compare, you know, the process through which these terms become, you know, prominent. In the case of the Shoah, of course, the path can be traced in a more clear way because you have the State of Israel, and the Shoah becomes the term that is adopted. Now, but in the Armenian case, it's not like that. You do have this different people trying to use different words, different reference. They come from different areas of the world. They have different reference points. But Yeher, they kept gravitating towards that term because it had, you know, it is in the Bible. Even Medyeher is in the Bible. It's in the Armenian Bible, and of course, it is associated more with natural catastrophes back then. The meaning evolves eventually to connote crime, you know, later on. So there is this struggle there, and you see it in the writings. You see it, and it really comes out as you know, it's a frustration. If you look at the newspapers after the 50s, right, 1965 is another turning point, the 50th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. You see, for example, Ramgavar newspapers in Lebanon, you know, using the term genocide. There's around that time there are statements made by political parties in which you have the term genocide mentioned on April 24, the term genocide mentioned several times for the first time. But still, the term Yeren was a term that was used more often, all the way into the 80s. I do believe that it's in the 80s that the word Armenian Genocide, Hagansi Raspanchun, essentially starts appearing more often than Yeren. Before that, it's probably, in the 70s, probably it was almost even less, I would say. Yeren was still prominent. But this struggle for looking for a word, even when Armenians knew the word genocide, they gravitated toward the Armenian word for it. What did happen eventually was, of course, we should not forget the American side, right? In the English-speaking world, the terms were used were words like Armenian massacres, right? It was, I believe, it was an easier transition from Armenian massacres to the Armenian genocide here in the United States than it was in Lebanon to replace a word like Yeren, which might be difficult to pronounce for a non-Armenian speaker, but it's just 2 syllables for an Armenian speaker, and with a word like Haigagan Terasponchun. What has happened, however, and that's the problematic aspect of this, is that recently, this attempt to avoid the term genocide, or referring properly to the Armenian genocide, by using Yeren, has created this situation where, some have called it even the bastardization of the term Yeren. And that's exactly what has happened. I mean, it is an attempt to really avoid, when people talk about the Holocaust and use the term Shoah or Holocaust, they're not doing it to avoid saying that, it was a genocide that was committed against the Jews. In the Armenian case, unfortunately, that became the name of the game. It started with the Pope's visit to Yerevan and other instances. President Bush, even in Turkey, and then later on President Obama. So that's the problem of the term Yeren as far as the non-Armenian world is concerned. But this terminology issue is to this day is one of significant importance. A lot of intellectuals, scholars, Armenians still use Yeren interchangeably. Other questions? Yeah.
Shouldn't we say that the first person who gave us the concept of genocide is Morgan himself, when he first time probably in the history of mankind.
The murder of a nation.
Murder of a nation, which means exactly the same thing as
Yes.
genocide. Genocide is the combination of
Yes, it's a term.
Greek and Latin. All Lemkin did is to translate it from English into Greek and Latin.
In fact, there is even
Murder of a nation is the word.
essentially is absolutely murder of a nation is one reference to that, and I would go beyond that and say that you have a lot of instances back then of referring to the Armenians in that way. It's destruction of a nation. Another aspect that needs to be underlined here is that the first time the term crimes against humanity was used in the international context. It was used for the Armenians in 1915 in reference to the Armenians. Of course, these are not medals that we're trying to, it's not something like, we are the first people who became victims of genocide and were called crimes against humanity was referred to them. But this also connotes the kind of the significance the genocide issue had back in the day. And then it also shows that how this everything was eventually with the establishment of the Turkish Republic and different political and other interests really pushed these issues under the rug. Other questions? Yes.
My mother, in speaking to about the slaughters of 1896-98, used the word chart as though that was the name of it, the proper name, capital letter.
Yes.
Slaughter.
Chart was very common in conversational Armenian. It was used to refer to many cases of massacres. 1894-96, 1906-1909 in Adana, 1915 the Armenian Genocide. In the writing though, this distinction is made clearly. It's more clear. In writing, journalists, writers, etc. avoid using chart without making any kind of particular specification. Sometimes they use Med's chart, the Great Massacre, right, to refer to 1915. So there's always some kind of additional description when it comes, an added adjective when it's referred, it's used in the context of referring to 1915. I have seen newspapers before 1915 publishing articles where they use the word Holocaust. Armenian newspapers, Vohchagizum, right, for the massacres in Adana. There are editorials, articles that were published back then in newspapers that mentioned this. I was recently in Vienna where I looked at the newspaper collection there of the Mechitarists. They have the largest collection of Armenian newspapers in the world. I looked at newspapers published before 1918. Actually, between 1918 and the early 1920s in Turkey itself. There were several Armenian language newspapers. This was a time when Turkey had lost the war. The British were in Istanbul. There was, it was an atmosphere where Armenian newspapers could be published, although there was still censorship. And you have a lot of references to these very same words there. The first commemorations of the genocide, right, happened around this time. 1918, 1919, 1920, in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Syria, etc. So this is a period that is really a period where people are trying to ask these hard questions, right? The kind of questions like, what is this that happened to us? It's a period when they're trying to figure out this calamity, the ways in which it had really undermined the Armenian nation, destroyed the Armenian nation. It's and it is this period that people are trying to figure out, find a word that really could express the extent, the scope of the calamity. It's so chart at some point doesn't cut it for them. It remains in the popular culture, but people try to move beyond it. Yes.
Given their history, the Turks, what prompted them to ratify the treaty?
I would say that essentially, yes, the question had to do with what prompted Turkey to ratify the convention. First, this is not my area of expertise. It's not a question I have fully answered looking at Turkish documents. My guess is that, and from the papers I read, from the general sense you get from Lemkin and others, contemporaries, it was done as a gesture. 1950 is a turning point for Turkish history as well. In 1950, the Turkish, for the first time, Turkey moves from a single-party system to a system of a multi-party system, and it's a turning point in that sense. So this is a period where Turkey is trying to assert itself as a different Turkey. And so it is in this context that Turkey ratified the Genocide Convention. The same way it did ratify other conventions around the same time. Remember, this is around the same time when conventions like on human rights, etc., are being discussed, ratified. So the Genocide Convention itself, while it is a central topic of this particular talk, was not. We cannot talk about it in It was happening. The discussions were happening around the same time, and there were several issues on the table. That's my sense. I would say, again, it's worth looking at the relevant diplomatic documents in Turkey to try to see what happened there, because I'm sure part of the discussions is this going to come back and bite us at some point? I mean, this was a discussion here in the United States. I doubt that it wouldn't be the same in Turkey. They're just 30 years away from the Armenian genocide. It's not. It hasn't been a long time. Yes.
Why did Lemkin think it was important for Turkey to be one of the first 20?
For him it was John Cooper, who has published a book on Raphael Lemkin and the Genocide Convention, argues that Lemkin wanted some kind of at least symbolic justice for the Armenian genocide. I tried to find references to it. He does not cite any source. In the documents I have seen, you see Lemkin clearly, really feeling that he has vested interest in getting this done. he really wants to do this. He feels that this would be some kind of symbolic justice for the Armenians if Turkey itself recognizes this. But if you really think about it, he also, to get Turkey to ratify the convention, he decided not to bring up the Armenian genocide issue. And this creates the frustration, right? In some documents, even Keshishian, the journalist he cites, goes to the United Nations right after these discussions, looks at the document, and he writes an article for the Armenian newspapers expressing his frustration that the Armenian genocide was not even mentioned a single time during the discussions at the UN. This could be part of it, part of the reason, right? Let us pass this, and then let's deal with the Armenians later. Obviously, not only, the obstacles are clear. I mean, the Genocide Convention itself was not ratified by the United States. So this frustration is appearing there. So, was there anything more than that? Did he want some kind of financial or any kind of reparations issue? That's what Cooper alludes to in his book. As I said, he does not cite any sources. I'm looking for some kind of reference, but at this point I have not found one. You do see his obsession with this issue of getting Turkey to recognize it. It's like some kind of thing, some kind of revenge act. But it's never, I've never found any direct, mention of the issue of justice. In Lemkin's papers, you have all kinds of references. Individuals go and, meet the lawyer of one of the Armenians who assassinated one of the Turkish leaders. They meet the lawyer and they write a letter to Lemkin. They say, by the way, Lemkin, we just met with the lawyer and this is what he said. So in his papers you have letters from Armenians and others really dealing with the Armenian genocide issue. And it's a fascinating facet. Unfortunately, many of the scholars who have dealt with this have come to this from a bigger, broader perspective. They wanted to write about the Genocide Convention, not about the Armenians. So the history, in a large part, is lost here, the Armenian portion of the history. And what I try to do in this paper, and I eventually want to expand this work, is to tell that segment of the story. Other questions? Yes?
In the convention, there is no mention of the Jewish genocide?
No. During the discussions, there is. But in the convention itself, let's say a few words, thank you for that question, about the convention itself. By the way, the convention has, as you know, several points, right? What constitutes genocide? You could see how, for example, today many Turkish historians argue that it is not genocide based on the United Nations Convention. But in fact, it's ironic because many of those points were made, were prepared, were put there because Lemkin and others were using the model of the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust when defining the very thing that they were trying to describe. So essentially, for example, many of those points apply for the Holocaust, but the forceful transfer of women and children from one group to the other, that is not a prominent aspect of the Holocaust at all. It is a prominent aspect of the Armenian genocide. Of course, in other colonial experiences. This is one aspect. The other thing is what was left out of the convention. Again, because of political considerations. For Lemkin, am I going on for too long here? For Lemkin, cultural genocide was an important issue. He realized that one of the ways in which a nation is killed is through destroying their culture, their cultural heritage. He could not get that in there. He does everything. But, there are many countries who are opposed to this. Because, again, they're afraid that it's going to come back and bite them. So, that's how the issue of cultural genocide is pushed to the side, and it's not part of the Genocide Convention, speaking of that. Yes?
I don't know how many countries have acknowledged Armenians as having experienced genocide, but perhaps you have that number, and do you know if any of them have attempted to take Turkey to the international court?
The answer to the second question is no. Most of the acknowledgements, they start in South America, and they spread in certain parts, Europe, elsewhere. In the Middle East, there's only Lebanon, Russia, etc. Germany is on the fence, sort of. It has its statement is very powerful. It does not include the word genocide standalone, right? And Has there been an attempt to take? No, there hasn't been such an attempt. Most of these are symbolic recognitions. Recognitions of the fact. For example, in France, not only the French Parliament, but also the French government, the French president has issued a statement saying, we recognize the Armenian Genocide of 1915, without even mentioning who the hell committed this genocide, right? It just says it's a symbolic act in general. So there has been no such effort.
Do you see it coming?
By other countries?
Can you see it?
I don't think so. Exactly, but it has to be a country to take. Yes. Convention, absolutely. Which at this point many countries are. Yes.
Can you tell us any more about Lemkin's motivations? What really was there a cathartic experience he had that made him so committed?
Lemkin, it's one of the issues where you really cannot pinpoint one particular experience. There are cases, for example, during his childhood, there are stories, right? He writes about his conversation with his mother, where when he hears about the experiences of the Christians in the Roman Empire, right? He asks his mother and has a discussion with her about why didn't these Christians who were being murdered call the police, right? Again, this kind of questioning of looking for some kind of authority to bring some kind of justice, right? I do believe that this existed with him. This feeling was there with him for a very long period of time. His argument with his professor at the University of Lvov is very interesting. Right after the assassination of Saul Montehilarian. It's another story I left out because it's better known by some at least, and I wanted to cut the time I spoke. During his conversation, the professor, he said, why is this man being tried? And the person who had killed 1 million people is not. These were his words. And the professor says, well, think about it as a farmer who has chickens. If the farmer decides to kill his or her own chickens, the neighbors have absolutely no right to intervene. So essentially he was evoking the issue of the sovereignty of nations. And this is the conflict, right? The friction zone between the sovereignty of nations and the concept that was defined later as universal jurisdiction. We are at these friction points, at these lines that separate these two. And of course Lemkin says, but the Armenians were not chickens. And there is this angst. He has this, and by the way, this should not be under. Lemkin himself lost most of his family during the Holocaust. This is significant. Sometimes he does not talk about it that much in his writings, specifically because he does not want people to think that he's in this for his own purposes, for some kind of job. Same thing. Just like he decides in certain places not to talk about the Armenian Genocide, he decides in other places not to talk about the Holocaust. Same thing with the organizations. Just like he plays up the importance of the Holocaust when he's talking to the Jewish groups, he plays up the importance of the Armenian Genocide, sorry for the expression, when he's talking to the Armenian groups. So for him, beyond all his personal feelings and experiences, at some point, this man becomes fixated on one particular issue. That was never, ever, really set in stone.